Police officer Richard Coleman angrily snatched the thick file from Naomi Carter's hand so quickly that many in the courtroom gasped in astonishment. The sound of the paper falling onto the witness stand echoed throughout the courtroom. All conversation ceased. Even the reporters sitting along the back wall put down their pens. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Naomi stood firm. Her shoulders were straight. Her face was calm. She didn't argue. What would you do if the very people who swore to uphold the law tried to silence the truth right in front of everyone? And what would happen if the woman they underestimated had spent years preparing for that moment? Follow us to the end of this story, because what happened in that courtroom will make the entire city question everything they've ever believed. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories of courage, justice, and the power of doing the right thing. She did not raise her voice. She simply watched as Officer Coleman placed the folder on the table beside him and stepped back with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the outcome. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor. The old clock above the judge's bench ticked steadily, filling the silence. Judge Eleanor Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. "Ms. Carter," she said carefully, "you were instructed to submit any materials through proper procedure." A few people nodded. Others exchanged knowing looks. To most of them, Naomi Carter appeared ordinary. Just another woman trying to challenge a respected officer. Just another voice destined to disappear beneath the weight of authority. That assumption had followed Naomi her entire life. At 34 years old, she worked in the county records archive in a quiet government building 6 blocks from the courthouse. Her days were spent surrounded by filing cabinets, storage boxes, and decades of forgotten documents. Few people knew her name. Fewer still remembered her face. She preferred it that way. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, carrying a worn leather bag and a large cup of coffee. Every evening, she left after most employees had gone home. Invisible. Predictable. Easy to overlook. Yet hidden behind that quiet routine was a discipline few could imagine. For 5 years, Naomi had spent countless hours reviewing records that nobody else bothered to read. Reports. Statements. Internal memos. Archived files covered in dust. Patterns began to emerge. Names appeared more than once. Dates failed to match. Details shifted in ways that made no sense. And one name kept returning to the center of it all. Richard Coleman. Across the courtroom, Officer Coleman stood surrounded by attorneys and department representatives. His uniform was immaculate. His reputation even cleaner. Local news stations called him a model officer. Community leaders praised his dedication. To many people, he represented integrity itself. Which was exactly why nobody questioned him. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes toward the small silver flash drive resting quietly in her palm. No one seemed to notice it. Not yet. Outside, a distant siren drifted through the city streets. Inside, the courtroom settled back into uneasy silence. And while everyone believed the confrontation had ended, Naomi knew something important. The real story had only just begun. Judge Eleanor Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes moving from Naomi Carter to the attorneys gathered near the front of the courtroom. Nobody spoke. The tension in the room felt heavier now, hanging in the air like a storm that had not yet decided where to break. Naomi remained still. Years of working around records and government offices had taught her something important. The loudest people were not always the most powerful. Sometimes power belonged to the person willing to wait. Across the room, Richard Coleman exchanged a brief glance with one of the department lawyers. It lasted less than a second, but Naomi noticed it. She noticed everything. That habit had started years earlier when she first accepted a position inside the county archives. The building itself sat between an aging courthouse and a tax office, a plain brick structure most people walked past without a second look. Inside, endless rows of metal shelving stretched beneath fluorescent lights that hummed softly throughout the day. Thousands upon thousands of documents filled the shelves. Most employees treated the files like background noise. Naomi treated them like pieces of a puzzle. 5 years earlier, while organizing old case records, she discovered a witness statement filed under the wrong case number. The mistake seemed insignificant at first. Then she found another. And another. Dates changed. Names disappeared. Reports that should have matched contained different details. The inconsistencies were small enough to escape attention but frequent enough to raise questions. Curiosity turned into concern. Concern turned into determination. She never discussed her findings with coworkers. Most were good people simply trying to finish their shifts and go home. Instead, Naomi quietly kept notes. Every evening she sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, reviewing public records and comparing timelines. The work was slow. Sometimes exhausting. But patterns gradually emerged. Certain investigations closed unusually fast. Certain complaints vanished without explanation. Certain officers appeared repeatedly in files connected by strange coincidences. Richard Coleman was one of those names. The discovery surprised her. Coleman was respected throughout the city. Newspapers praised his professionalism. Community organizations invited him to events. Local television stations interviewed him whenever a major case made headlines. The image was nearly flawless. That was exactly why Naomi continued digging. Perfect stories rarely survived close inspection. Back in the courtroom, sunlight shifted across the floor as clouds drifted beyond the tall windows. The silver flash drive remained hidden in Naomi's hand. Its cool edges pressed lightly against her fingers. Everything she had spent years documenting rested inside that small device. Not rumors. Not opinions. Evidence. Verified records. Original files. Information collected carefully and legally over countless late nights. A court clerk walked quietly across the room carrying a stack of documents. The soft sound of footsteps echoed briefly before fading away. Judge Brooks glanced toward the clock mounted above the courtroom doors. Then she returned her attention to Naomi. Something in the judge's expression had changed. The skepticism was still there, but now another emotion had joined it. Curiosity. Naomi recognized it immediately. For the first time that morning, someone was beginning to wonder why an otherwise invisible records employee had risked everything to stand in that courtroom. And Naomi knew that once the question started, the answers would be impossible to ignore. Richard Coleman had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation that seemed untouchable. Long before he entered the courtroom that morning, people throughout the city already knew his name. His photograph appeared on community center walls, charity event brochures, and local news websites. School principals shook his hand during safety programs. Business leaders praised his leadership. City officials often mentioned him whenever they spoke about public trust. To most people, Richard Coleman represented stability. The kind of person whose word carried weight before he even spoke. Sitting behind the prosecution table, he looked completely at ease. His uniform was perfectly pressed. His posture never shifted. Every movement appeared measured and controlled. The attorneys beside him listened carefully whenever he leaned over to speak. Even now, after the unexpected disruption involving Naomi Carter, he showed no visible concern. That confidence was not accidental. It came from years of being believed. Across the courtroom, several reporters quietly reviewed notes on their laptops. A few occasionally glanced toward Coleman, clearly expecting the hearing to continue as planned. Nobody was writing stories about Naomi. Nobody had arrived expecting her name to matter. In their minds, she was simply a records employee who had stepped into a situation far beyond her position. That assumption worked in Coleman's favor. It always had. People trusted familiar faces. They trusted titles. They trusted carefully constructed reputations. Naomi understood that better than anyone. Years spent reviewing archived documents had shown her how often perception influenced reality. The files never cared about popularity. Dates did not care about public opinion. Records told their stories whether people liked them or not. That was why she trusted evidence more than appearances. Judge Eleanor Brooks folded her hands and studied the room. The courtroom itself felt unusually still. Sunlight continued to move slowly across the polished wood surfaces. Dust particles drifted through narrow beams of light near the windows. Somewhere outside, church bells rang the quarter hour. The sound reached the courtroom faintly before disappearing again. Naomi looked briefly toward the gallery. Most faces were unfamiliar. But she recognized one person near the back row. An older man wearing a gray suit sat quietly with a notebook resting on his knee. Daniel Mercer. An investigative journalist. Years earlier, his reporting had exposed financial misconduct inside a neighboring county government. He rarely attended routine hearings. If he was here, it meant he sensed something unusual beneath the surface. Their eyes met for less than a second before he returned to his notes. Naomi tightened her grip around the flash drive hidden inside her hand. She remembered the first time she almost gave up. 3 years earlier she had stared at a stack of conflicting reports spread across her kitchen table. The evidence seemed incomplete. The patterns felt impossible to prove. She had nearly packed everything into a box and moved on with her life. Then she discovered one overlooked file buried inside an archive transfer. One document led to another. Another led to 10 more. The picture slowly became clearer. Back in the present, Coleman exchanged another quiet conversation with his legal team. He appeared relaxed. Certain. Unbothered. Yet Naomi noticed something subtle. For the first time that morning, he glanced toward her. Not dismissively. Not casually. He looked directly at her hand. Then his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. And in that tiny moment, Naomi realized something important. Richard Coleman had finally understood that she was carrying more than questions. The silence inside the courtroom stretched a little longer than normal. Judge Eleanor Brooks reviewed several pages in front of her while attorneys whispered among themselves. Most people assumed the hearing was moving toward a predictable conclusion. Naomi Carter knew otherwise. The flash drive resting in her hand felt heavier than its size should have allowed. Years of work. Years of questions. Years of carefully documented facts. Everything depended on what happened next. She slowly stepped forward. The movement immediately caught attention throughout the room. One reporter stopped typing. Another lowered a camera. Even the court clerk looked up. Naomi cleared her throat. Her voice remained calm. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to submit additional material directly to the court record. The request seemed simple enough, yet the reaction was immediate. Richard Coleman sat forward in his chair. One of the attorneys beside him quickly stood. Objection, he said. The material has not been reviewed through standard procedure. Several heads nodded. The argument sounded reasonable. It sounded official. It sounded safe. Naomi had expected it. Judge Brooks looked toward Naomi. Ms. Carter, why was this material not submitted earlier? For a moment, every eye in the room focused on her. Naomi felt the weight of those stares but refused to look away. Because until this morning, Your Honor, I was not certain anyone would be willing to examine it. A murmur spread quietly through the gallery. The judge remained expressionless. And what exactly does this material contain? Naomi glanced briefly at the flash drive. Then she answered. Original records. Archived reports. Internal communications. Documents that have never been reviewed together. The room became still again. Across the courtroom, Coleman folded his hands. His face revealed nothing. Yet Naomi noticed his jaw tighten slightly. It lasted only a second before his professional composure returned. The judge noticed it too. Naomi could tell. Years on the bench had trained Eleanor Brooks to read people the way other people read books. You are asking this court to consider information gathered over several years, the judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. And you believe it is relevant to today's proceedings? I do. The answer came without hesitation. Sunlight shifted again through the windows. The warm glow illuminated the edge of the witness stand and reflected softly across the polished floor. Somewhere near the back row, Daniel Mercer paused his note-taking entirely. He was watching now. Not as a journalist chasing a headline. As someone sensing the beginning of something larger. Naomi reached into her bag and removed a thin binder. Unlike the folder taken from her earlier, this binder contained copies of publicly accessible records organized in chronological order. Every page had been labeled. Every source documented. Every date verified. She carefully placed it on the evidence table. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silent room. Judge Brooks stared at the binder for several seconds. Then she looked toward Coleman. For the first time all morning, the respected officer did not immediately meet her eyes. It was a small detail. Most people would never have noticed it. Naomi did. And so did the judge. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough. The certainty that had protected Coleman for years was beginning to crack. And everyone could feel it. The moment the binder touched the evidence table, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted again. This time everyone felt it. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was slowly giving way to uncertainty. One attorney immediately stood. Then another. Papers moved. Quiet conversations began. The hearing that had seemed routine only an hour earlier was suddenly becoming something else. Judge Eleanor Brooks looked down at the binder and then toward the attorneys representing the department. "Have any of you reviewed these records?" she asked. No one answered immediately. The silence was answer enough. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Reporters who had appeared board minutes earlier were now typing rapidly. The sound of keyboards echoed softly through the room. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the evidence table. She knew what was happening. For years, information had existed in separate places. One report here. One file there. A forgotten memo buried in storage. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, the picture became impossible to ignore. Richard Coleman finally rose from his chair. The movement drew immediate attention. He buttoned his jacket and addressed the court in the calm, practiced tone that had served him throughout his career. "Your Honor, with respect, this entire situation is based on speculation from someone who is not an investigator, not an attorney, and not directly involved in these cases." Several heads nodded. The statement sounded reasonable. Naomi had expected that too. Coleman continued. "Ms. Carter works in records management. That does not qualify her to interpret complex investigations." A few quiet chuckles came from somewhere in the back of the room. Naomi heard them. She had heard similar things before. The assumptions. The dismissals. The certainty that someone in her position could not possibly understand what powerful people understood. Yet she did not react. She simply listened. Judge Brooks turned toward her. "Would you like to respond?" Naomi took a slow breath. "No, Your Honor." The answer surprised everyone. Even the reporters paused. Coleman appeared slightly relieved. But Naomi was not finished. She looked toward the judge. "I am not asking this court to trust my interpretation. I am asking the court to examine the records themselves." The room became quiet again. That single sentence landed differently. It removed personality from the equation. It removed opinion. It shifted attention back to the documents. Back to facts. Coleman folded his arms. His expression remained controlled, but the confidence from earlier had begun to fade around the edges. Daniel Mercer watched closely from the gallery. His pen stopped moving entirely. Naomi could almost see the questions forming in his mind. Judge Brooks opened the binder. The first page appeared ordinary enough. Then she turned another. Then another. Her eyes slowed. She looked more carefully. The courtroom waited. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Outside, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky, dimming the sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows. The room seemed darker now. More serious. Finally, the judge closed the binder and rested both hands on top of it. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all day. Then she looked directly at Richard Coleman. And for the first time since the hearing began, the respected officer appeared unsure of what would happen next. Judge Eleanor Brooks remained silent for several long seconds after closing the binder. Then she announced a brief recess. The wooden gavel tapped softly once, and the courtroom slowly began to empty. Conversations started immediately. Reporters gathered near the hallway doors. Attorneys moved into small groups. Questions floated through the air like distant echoes. Naomi Carter stepped away from the evidence table and followed a court clerk into a small waiting room reserved for witnesses. The room was simple. Beige walls. A single window. 2 chairs. A coffee machine humming quietly in the corner. For the first time all day, she was alone. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The silence felt almost unfamiliar after hours of tension. Naomi sat near the window and placed the silver flash drive carefully on the table in front of her. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass, creating a narrow ribbon of light across its metal surface. She stared at it without speaking. 5 years. 5 years of early mornings, late nights, and weekends spent reviewing records that nobody else wanted to read. 5 years of wondering whether she was wasting her time. 5 years of carrying questions that seemed too large for one person to answer. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily along the street below. People crossed intersections. Delivery trucks rolled past the courthouse. Somewhere a siren sounded in the distance before fading away. The city continued with its ordinary routines, completely unaware that inside one courtroom, something important was beginning to unfold. Naomi leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. She was 16 again, sitting beside her father on the front steps of their apartment building. Summer heat filled the evening air. The city glowed beneath orange streetlights. Her father had worked maintenance jobs his entire life. People often overlooked him. Yet he possessed a quiet wisdom she never forgot. Whenever something unfair happened, he always said the same thing. Truth does not need to be louder than a lie. It only needs to survive long enough to be seen. At the time, Naomi had not fully understood those words. Now she did. The waiting room door remained closed. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her. The stillness allowed something unusual to happen. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she felt calm. Not confident. Not victorious. Simply calm. Whatever happened next was no longer entirely in her control. The evidence existed. The records existed. The facts existed. Whether people accepted them was another matter. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Naomi opened her eyes. The court clerk stepped inside. "The judge will reconvene shortly," she said. Naomi nodded. The clerk hesitated before leaving. "For what it is worth," she added quietly, "I have never seen Judge Brooks review a binder that carefully." Then she disappeared into the hallway. Naomi looked once more at the flash drive resting beneath the sunlight. The room felt brighter now. Outside, clouds drifted apart, allowing golden afternoon light to spread across the city. She picked up the drive and slipped it into her pocket. Somewhere beyond the waiting room walls, attorneys were preparing arguments. Reporters were preparing stories. Richard Coleman was preparing explanations. But Naomi knew something they did not. The most important evidence had not yet been seen. When the courtroom reconvened, the energy felt completely different. The conversations that had filled the hallways during recess vanished the moment Judge Eleanor Brooks returned to the bench. Every seat in the gallery was occupied. Additional reporters had arrived. Even people with no connection to the hearing seemed drawn by the growing sense that something unusual was about to happen. Naomi Carter took her place quietly. She noticed cameras being adjusted. Not television. Cameras. Court-approved media equipment. Journalists were preparing for developments they could not yet predict. Across the room, Richard Coleman appeared composed once again. Yet the confidence he had carried earlier now felt practiced rather than natural. The difference was subtle. Most people would not have recognized it. Naomi did. Judge Brooks opened the hearing with a brief statement. Then she looked directly at Naomi. "You indicated there is additional material not included in the binder." Naomi nodded. The room immediately became silent. She reached into her pocket and removed the silver flash drive. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the court clerk approached and accepted it. The tiny device crossed the room in complete silence before arriving at the evidence station connected to the courtroom display system. Richard Coleman sat perfectly still. One attorney beside him shifted uneasily. Another opened a notebook and began writing rapidly. Naomi watched without emotion. Years earlier she might have felt nervous. Today she felt only certainty. Facts did not become less true because powerful people disliked them. Judge Brooks authorized the review. The court technician inserted the drive. Several folders appeared on the screen. The first contained archived records already referenced in the binder. The second contained original document versions preserved from digital backups. A murmur spread quietly through the gallery. Then the third folder appeared. It was labeled Timeline Correlation. The technician opened it. A detailed visual timeline filled the screen. Dates. Case numbers. Internal references. Personnel assignments. Everything organized chronologically across multiple years. What had seemed unrelated when viewed separately now appeared connected. Reporters leaned forward. Attorneys exchanged worried looks. The judge studied the display carefully. Then another file opened. This one contained internal communication logs acquired through public records requests and archive preservation systems. Messages appeared alongside corresponding case dates. Several entries contradicted official summaries already discussed in court. The atmosphere changed. Instantly. Nobody was looking at Naomi anymore. Everyone was looking at the evidence. Daniel Mercer lowered his notebook completely. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. Years of investigative reporting had taught him how rare moments like this truly were. Across the courtroom, Coleman finally shifted in his chair. It was the first visible sign of discomfort anyone had seen all day. Judge Brooks noticed. So did the reporters. Then the technician opened the final folder. The room seemed to stop breathing. Inside were original audit records showing modification histories connected to multiple archived reports. Every change carried a digital timestamp. Every timestamp carried a user credential. Every credential pointed to the same source. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the courtroom projector. Judge Brooks stared at the screen. Then slowly, very slowly, she removed her glasses. The expression on her face was not anger. It was realization. And in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. Naomi Carter had not spent 5 years collecting suspicions. She had spent 5 years documenting proof. For several moments after the final file appeared on the courtroom screen, nobody spoke. The evidence no longer required interpretation. It spoke for itself. Reporters who had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing now found themselves witnessing something far more significant. Pages turned. Keyboards clicked. The story was already spreading beyond the courtroom walls. Judge Eleanor Brooks remained focused on the display. She reviewed several entries again before looking toward the attorneys seated at the front of the room. The questions she asked were direct. The answers were noticeably less certain than they had been earlier in the day. Richard Coleman sat quietly. The authority that had once seemed unquestionable now appeared fragile. Not because anyone had attacked him. Not because anyone had raised their voice. But because documented facts had entered the conversation. Facts were difficult to argue with. The gallery remained completely silent. Even the people who had doubted Naomi Carter earlier were no longer looking at her with skepticism. They were looking at her with curiosity. Some with respect. Others with disbelief. How had a records employee uncovered information that so many others had missed? The answer was simple. She had never stopped looking. Judge Brooks requested an independent review of the materials and ordered that the records be preserved immediately. The announcement sent another wave of whispers through the room. Several attorneys exchanged concerned looks. Others began making phone calls the moment permission was granted. Naomi remained standing. She felt no satisfaction. No triumph. Only relief. The burden she had carried for years was finally visible to people other than herself. Daniel Mercer closed his notebook and approached the aisle. He did not rush forward like the other reporters. He simply watched. Experienced journalists understood that the most important moments often happened after the headlines. Across the room, Judge Brooks turned toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said. "You spent years compiling this material." "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" The question echoed through the silent courtroom. Naomi considered it carefully. Then she answered. "Because records represent people. And when records are changed, people lose their voices." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Her words settled over the room with quiet force. Judge Brooks nodded slowly. The answer seemed to affect her more than anyone expected. Outside the courthouse windows, late afternoon sunlight painted the city in warm gold. The light reflected across the courtroom floor and climbed the wooden walls. For the first time all day, the room felt different. Less like a battlefield. More like a place where truth could finally be heard. One of the attorneys stood and offered a formal statement acknowledging the seriousness of the evidence. Another requested additional time for review. The hearing was no longer about protecting reputations. It was about understanding facts. Naomi glanced briefly toward Richard Coleman. Their eyes met for a second. She felt no anger toward him. No desire for revenge. Years earlier she might have. Not anymore. The goal had never been to destroy someone. The goal had always been to reveal the truth. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, people began to understand something that had remained hidden for years. The most powerful person in the room had never been the one with the title, the uniform, or the public recognition. It had been the woman who refused to look away when everyone else did. The hearing ended just before sunset. One by one, people gathered their papers and quietly left the courtroom. The noise that had filled the building throughout the day gradually faded until only scattered footsteps remained in the hallways. Judge Eleanor Brooks issued orders preserving the evidence and authorizing a formal independent review. What happened after that would unfold through proper legal channels, exactly as it should. The process was no longer built on assumptions. It was built on facts. Naomi Carter stood alone for a moment near the back of the courtroom. The wooden benches were nearly empty now. The projector had been turned off. The screens were dark. Yet somehow the room felt brighter than it had that morning. Daniel Mercer approached before leaving. He held his notebook under one arm. "You could have walked away years ago," he said quietly. Naomi smiled faintly. "A lot of people did." Mercer nodded. He seemed to understand. Then he offered a simple handshake and disappeared into the hallway. Outside the courthouse, the city glowed beneath the warm colors of early evening. Reporters waited near the entrance hoping for statements. Attorneys hurried toward waiting vehicles. Government officials spoke quietly among themselves. Naomi avoided the attention. She stepped down the courthouse stairs and walked toward the public square across the street. The air felt cooler now. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Their leaves shimmered in the fading sunlight. She sat on a bench facing the courthouse and watched the sky slowly change from gold to deep blue. For the first time in years, she carried nothing home with her. No hidden files. No unanswered questions. No fear that the truth would disappear before anyone saw it. The burden was no longer hers alone. In the weeks that followed, multiple records were reviewed. Procedures were examined. Questions that had been ignored finally received attention. Most importantly, people whose concerns had once been overlooked were given an opportunity to be heard. That mattered more to Naomi than any headline ever could. One morning several months later, she returned to the archives as usual. The building looked exactly the same. The shelves remained full. The lights still hummed softly overhead. Yet something had changed. Employees greeted her by name. People who had never spoken to her before stopped to thank her. Not because she had become famous. Because she had reminded them that ordinary people can protect the truth too. As she organized a new collection of records, Naomi paused beside a window. Sunlight streamed across the floor just as it had on countless mornings before. She thought about her father's words. Truth does not need to be louder than a lie. It only needs to survive long enough to be seen. He had been right all along. Far outside the archive building, life continued. Cars moved through intersections. Children walked home from school. Workers ended their shifts. Most of them would never know Naomi Carter personally. But they would benefit from something she had refused to surrender. Accountability. The simple belief that every voice matters and every record tells a human story. Naomi looked out the window one final time and smiled. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones standing in the spotlight. They are the ones who quietly refuse to look away. And if you had discovered the same truth years earlier, would you have risked everything to reveal it, or would you have remained silent and hoped someone else would act?